Her albinism was deemed a curse by her community. His mixed ancestry left him outside any community. Their meeting during Civil War and as countries across Africa broke colonial bonds tells a story of much more than just a powerful love. The book is Children of the Moon, and it is the latest from novelist and short story writer Anthony Dessau. And we're pleased to bring him back to our studios. Hi.
Hi there.
It's my first time meeting you. It's really nice to see you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Loved the book.
Wonderful.
Loved the book. On the dust jacket for Children of the Moon, it refers to the book being an exploration of the love of two people. That's one way that the book has been described. But my sense of it is that it's much more than that, isn't it?
It certainly is. Essentially, the core of the novel is this love between these two characters. But it's really about loving oneself, an identity, trying to understand what that means, and the ultimate sacrifice that results from that. But it is also a love of country, a love of place, a love of family. It somehow is all wrapped up in that one big package.
What prompted you to write a book that's set in East Africa?
Well, I think a story always finds you, and you know, I'm not that kind of person that goes out looking for a story.
So how did this book find you?
This one found me because I grew up in a Portuguese family here in Toronto that was a family of storytelling, and yet there was one story that we never spoke of.
What story was that?
And that was the story of my uncle's involvement in the colonial wars in Africa and what that did to them. My uncle Clement was in the colonial war in Portuguese Guinea, which is now Guinea-Bissau. And he went when he was 19 years old. And when he came back after his 3-year mandatory military service, I was quite horrified recently to find out that he came back after that incredible experience, a broken man, and came home to a small village in San Miguel in the Azores, only to find that his parents and his younger brother of 14 had immigrated to Canada, unbeknownst to him. So he felt abandoned and alone. And of course, my grandparents had left with my Uncle Louis at that age because my grandmother was not going to lose another son to that war. Some of my aunts can recall years and years where there wasn't a week that went by where an uncle wouldn't rattle out of bed at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and try to take cover.
Because they were soldiers in for the Portuguese side.
Yes.
Because in the book, you write from the perspective of, I guess, it's fair to say 3 characters,
yes.
3 people. 2 of them are native to East Africa.
Yes.
And then one person, a journalist, is coming as an observer. You write about a woman, but she's a person with albinism.
Yes.
How did you become aware of the struggles facing people with albinism in Tanzania and Mozambique, the countries that you write about in the book?
I think the first time I became aware of the particular problem of people with albinism in many parts of Africa was an article that I had read in National Geographic. And I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that in this day and age, that kind of act of inhumanity was occurring on a daily basis. And for viewers out there, I mean, it really is a sense that these people with albinism are being hunted, and many of their body parts are being taken from them and sold by healers to the highest bidder. And I was horrified by this idea. And so I'm a very curious person. I read this one article and just delved further and further until it got to the point where I contacted Peter Ash, who runs an NGO, an organization out of Burnaby, BC, called Under the Same Sun. And I just point blank asked him, could I travel with you to Tanzania the next time you are there? And I want to interview and research and At one point, we took a convoy to a private school because one of the things that Under the Same Sun does is they support families and children with albinism by putting them in private schools that are heavily guarded so that there is no issue or we can fend off anything that might occur. But
someone just hearing that you have guards to protect,
yes.
It's that bad.
It's that bad. And so when I was there, it just so happened to be their kind of March break or reading week. And this is a residential school, so all of these students are in residences there. Mm-hmm. And all the children had gone home for this week, except for the 80 or so children with albinism because their parents just don't pick them up. Because there's such a fear of taking them back to their small rural villages and the fate that might await them.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because in the book, Poe,
yes.
I guess she would be the string. She's the main
right.
character. She is born in a village in a rural area, but she also spends time in one of Tanzania's biggest cities.
Yes.
Are attitudes towards people with albinism different in rural areas as opposed to the city?
Yes. So when I was in Dar es Salaam, it was quite common to see, for example, a person with albinism as a street vendor or walking the streets. When you start going into the rural areas, and I flew to Mwanza out by Lake Victoria, that's where much of what is happening to these people is occurring in the rural areas. So you wouldn't see anyone there. I, at one point, went for a walk to the market with someone with albinism, and he had the courage to do that. He was living in Vancouver at the time, and I was quite struck that he was comfortable with leaving with me. But about 5 minutes in, he got very nervous, and we had to turn back. And when I pressed him and asked him what it was, he said he had been in an attack previously. He says that it's not something he can define, but it was the way people were looking at him. And so we quickly made our way back to the hotel.
Mm-hmm. What do you attribute the differences to? If it's more, I guess, if you're in the city, they might feel safer than if you're in a rural area.
Well, rural areas tend to be a little more impoverished. Smaller communities where healers loom large, and they have an immense effect on how people behave.
They have a lot of power.
They have a lot of power still in many of these communities, and they are the go-to. I mean, you're not going to drive for 5 hours to get to a hospital.
So somebody gets sick, they could say it's because of that person with
That's
albinism.
exactly right. And so it's just, it makes sense.
Well, one of the things that you bring up in the book that I've also been reading to do research for this interview is that a person with albinism is seen as a curse on one hand, but yet their bones are used to bring good fortune. How do you explain that?
I think that it's the idea that somehow these people who have these children, they believe that these children are ghosts, essentially, and that therefore they have been given to them as a curse, but also they could be used as a blessing. And so often, many times, it's the family members who are actually selling the children or informing others to do a dirty deed to these children. And they don't believe because they are human, they feel that these children are spirits, that they don't have the same feelings or understandings. It's quite astonishing to me.
There's a scene in the book that I was kind of like, I didn't know what you were trying to say, because Poe is interacting with an elephant calf.
Yes.
And then right after that, she gets out alive after the mother elephant, and we all know that mother elephants are very maternal and they can be very dangerous if you're around their children. Why did you want to include this book? Because I think what you're trying to say is Poe is attempting to undermine all the superstition around albinism, the myth of them being supernatural beings. But then you included this scene.
Right, and I include the scene, and I made it very clear at the very beginning of the book that Poe has had people come interview her, and they've come and gone, and nothing has come of it. And right from the very first chapter in her musings, she has decided that Seraphim will be different and her story will be different.
And Seraphim is the journalist.
Is the journalist from Brazil. And she will approach it in a very different way. And I think at one point she says, I have lived all these years and have tried to find the words. I finally have them. So there's a sense almost that in that story, because Seraphim does challenge her on her recollection of that event, and challenges her on the idea of it's almost impossible for that to have happened. And so I set up the idea that we as readers really are drawn to Poe, but we also understand that in many respects she's an unreliable narrator.
You set the story in a hotel called the Grand Hotel.
Yes.
And it's a real place in Beira,
In
Mozambique?
Beira, yes.
Beira in Mozambique. You've been there.
I have.
What was it like to be there?
Yes, I mean, the Grand Hotel was what its name suggested. When it was built, it was the grandest of hotels. But it had a short life, and it was closed. And then it was shrouded for many years until the Civil War happened right after the Colonial War through the 70s and into the 80s in Mozambique. What is there now is simply a shell of what once was. Everything has been stripped.
Just like the copper wiring, everything.
Yes, everything,
wood.
copper, wood, any kind of metal. There's no running water, there's no electricity.
But there's a lot of people that live there still.
2,000. 2,000 people live there as squatters, many of them immigrants or refugees. A year doesn't go by where a child doesn't crawl through the hallway and fall down the empty elevator shaft.
Because that's what they use for latrine?
Yes, they do.
As a toilet?
Yeah. Yes, they do. So I was actually surprised that I got to go in. It's not a very safe place. But I had a journalist friend who managed to get the foreman, the unofficial foreman, to take me through a guided tour of the hotel. It was the most remarkable place.
Well, a few minutes ago, you talked about the privilege of, we obviously are very privileged living in Toronto and having the lives that we do. What was it like to see 2,000 people, you said, live in that place where you set this book in?
It's difficult to describe the dichotomy of these marvelous things that are part of a luxurious hotel. The flooring, some of the beautiful flooring and the designs are still there. But then you have people cooking their meals in these small little charcoal fires in the middle of the hallway. Doors have been removed because, of course, they were wooden and used as fuel. So you just have cardboard boxes that are stacked up high, covering the doorways. Hallways are dark because there's no lighting, filled with smoke. There is a kind of almost surreal apocalyptic feel to the place. And it was really quite stunning.
We've talked about Seraphim a couple times, and he's the journalist, and he's there to speak to Poe and write a book about people with albinism. In one of his chapters, I just wanted you to read this thing that you wrote and what he, from here.
Thank you. Poe provided me with the names of people who had been attacked, murdered, and even those whose graves had been robbed. But it is the unwillingness of the police or government authorities to address the atrocities that takes so much out of her. The fight is draining her, and she looks frail. I am committed to reporting her story as she tells it. I have been detached, an observer who keeps one eye open and the other eye, the passionate eye, shut. No more. From now on, both eyes wide open.
How much of you is there in Seraphim?
I think there's a lot of me in Seraphim, and I didn't think it was initially going to be that way. But you do feel like you are coming from some different place, and you are writing and talking about a place and a story and the incredibly wonderful people that inhabit that world. And so the way you've perceived places in Africa in your privileged life here in Canada or wherever it is you come from changes very much. And you begin to see things very differently. And you have to keep your eyes open, and you have to open your heart to what's going on. There was a real, not that I was inhumane before, but a real sense that there was a humanity here that somehow we are kept from. And it was quite beautiful and touching.
What advantages do you think you had in reporting this story through fiction instead of maybe writing a memoir?
Well, to write a memoir, I didn't have enough. And I mean, my uncles were reluctant to even mention the fact that they were there. And to be honest with you, it's fiction for me is an exploration of that world without the kind of straps, if you will, to keep me down in terms of what it is that I wanted to explore and how it was that I wanted to meld these two stories and these two worlds. And so for me, it was liberating that way. That being said, I think there's a responsibility to always be respectful of that time and that place and the people involved. And I hope I did that.
Well, we've talked about two of the characters in the book. We've talked about Poe and Seraphim. The third character is Ezekiel.
Yes.
And he becomes a child soldier in Mozambique. How did you research that aspect of the book?
This part came from my actual trip to Mozambique, visiting the archives there, the museums, speaking with people at the universities there and the people who actually fought in the war. It was fascinating to me. Now, I would say that, you know, child soldier is something that is relatively new to us. I think during the colonial wars, we wouldn't have used that term.
It'd just be soldier.
That's right. And so being kidnapped the way he is by this renegade group of men and forced to fight a war he doesn't quite understand, and then being captured by the Portuguese and being asked to fight for them was a fascinating exploration of what was going on during that time. I found it also incredibly interesting that unlike other wars, or maybe there are similarities to others, the role of the Portuguese in those colonial wars and who fought for the Portuguese, it wasn't just Portuguese soldiers like my uncles, it was Mozambicans, Portuguese Mozambicans, and in many respects, many of them black. So you had brother fighting against brother. I recently was speaking to the president of an organization here in Ontario. It's the Ontario Association of Portuguese Veterans. His name is Armando Branco. And he was in the Mozambique conflict, and he felt abandoned by his government, by his nation. And he said that at one point, he didn't speak to his own brother for 22 years because his brother was fighting for Frelimo, the guerrilla insurgency.
So families were split apart.
Families were torn apart.
Were torn apart. And this is what happens to Ezekiel when he was 11 years old, a young child. Ezekiel kind of reminded me of my father, because my father was born in East Africa. He was mixed race. Ezekiel is half Portuguese, half black.
Yes.
How similar is that to Poe's being a person with albinism?
Well, I think it's, I mean, there are vast differences, but it certainly is something to contend with when our identity is solely, where identity is defined by color. And both of these characters have a difficult time with that. Poe is a strong character, a strong woman who doesn't allow—
A resourceful woman.
A resourceful woman who doesn't allow her albinism to define her. Ezekiel, he for the longest time, although he is mixed, biracial, sees himself through a white lens. And it's only at a certain point in the novel that he begins to see what is happening, and he
feels guilty.
He feels guilty for having adopted this side of him that he's never questioned.
Is this a story of love triumphant, or is love incapable of overcoming all the difficulties the characters face in the book?
I'm a hopeful romantic, and I believe that love can conquer all of that. Sounds
even in
very
time of
cliche.
war?
Not during time of war, though.
Yeah.
And I don't believe that love is necessarily that happy ending. I believe that there are people out there that we love, that we have always loved and always will love, but sometimes we just can't be together.
From the book, too, what I got from it was that someone witnessing your life, that is love.
Yes, and bearing witness to that life, and not judging it. You know, Poe does a remarkable thing. There's an incredible sacrifice there, and it is without judgment. If that isn't love, I don't know what is.
It's a beautiful read. It made me cry.
Thank you so much.
It was frustrating at times because I was like, don't do that, but it made me
Yes,
cry. It's a beautiful
thank you.
book. Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.